For our latter visits to Papalacta, we had been based at the wonderfully rustic Guango Lodge. Which sits appropriately enough alongside the upper reaches of the Guango River at 2,700 metres. Like all good lodges in the Ecuadorian highlands, it has an area set aside with hummingbird feeders. Buff-tailed coronets were plentiful. Despite being only local on the east slope, Guango is a site where they can be pretty much guaranteed. The related chestnut-breasted coronets were also here in good numbers. Buff-based throat feathers suggest this may be a female, but there is still a debate as to whether this is a definitive feature for separating the sexes. Another common species was the tourmaline sun angel. The males being unmistakable when flashing their sparkling blue chin, pink throat and green breastband. At only 10 centimetres they are small, but seem to take on a different appearance in flight, now looking more rakish with long wings and forked tail, and with the most obvious feature now being striking white undertail coverts. Some white on the chin, throat and underparts indicate this may be a young male. However, interestingly, females can be variable, with some apparently almost indistinguishable from males, whereas others look more typically paler with a contrasting white throat. More colour was provided by the dazzling long-tailed sylphs. Another form is present on the west side of the Andes, but they lack any throat patch. The long tail alternates between a blue and a green sheen, depending on the angle of the light. Collared incas were also regularly seen. The males have a small violet-blue crown patch, but their most conspicuous feature is the large white shield across the breast. Females are similar, but the mostly green coloration is nowhere near as blackish toned as it is on the male. Other species at the feeders included Tyrian metaltail, speckled hummingbird, and, as at Yanacocha, a frustratingly brief sword-billed hummingbird. There were more feeders by a sheltered rondavel, a good place to watch from during the frequent showers. The starbirds were the white-bellied woodstars, actually quite widespread on both sides of the Andes, but these were the first we'd seen on the trip. Males are basically green and white with a pinkish-violet throat. The females have a white throat and rufous flanks. Close to the rondavel there was a site for the lovely chestnut-crowned Antpitta. A pair could sometimes be tempted into the open with the usual lure of worms. They are not uncommon and can often be heard calling in forests above 2,000 metres, but getting views like these requires a typical Antpitta stakeout. Despite the almost constant rain, we found more birds in the lodge grounds. Inquisitive turquoise jays were early morning visitors. There was also a pair of masked trogons. Unlike those we'd seen around Mindo, males of the subspecies here have limited white barring on the undertail. There's no difference on the females. There was also this Andean guan feeding on berries. As was a northern or golden-shouldered mountain cacique. A mostly hidden, hooded mountain tanager rummaging amongst the bromeliads. A female great thrush. Grey-hooded bush tanager. A white-banded tyrannulet, and a furtive female green and black fruit-eater back near the Rondevelle. The rain didn't stop us venturing further afield, and we followed a trail close to the Guango River. A small flock of pearled tree runners were a nice find. A scarce red-hooded tanager perched out in the open, but in frustratingly poor light. Plus spectacled redstart, and a brief black-capped hemispingus. In open terrain was a more obliging cinnamon flycatcher. A pair of rufous-breasted chat tyrants. And a slaty-backed chat tyrant. Along the river itself were a pair of white-capped dippers. As well as foraging, they were also seen collecting nesting material. Another trail across the main road led through thicker habitat. Here we found a rather secretive plushcap and a tyrannine woodcreeper, the only plain woodcreeper likely to be found in this region. During a break in the weather, we also took an afternoon excursion to Baeza, with more views of Antizana along the way. Before more rain arrived, we birded the town's quieter roads. Amongst others, we saw this tropical mockingbird, a recent colonizer here, a juvenile black-billed thrush, a just visible saffron-crowned tanager, one of a flock of Inca jays, and noisy passing flocks of red-billed parrots. Moving on from Guango Lodge, the weather hadn't improved. And along the way, our journey was curtailed by a major landslide. We consoled ourselves with some birding from the road, enjoying great views of spectacled redstart. Before finally being allowed to drive through.
Hey, we're not moving. It's a little bit difficult to pass the other car.
The stream is still that hillside.
By lunchtime, we had reached San Borja and took the chance to bird some of the more open habitat here, where we found this immature male black-capped tanager, still showing green on the mantle. A blue-necked tanager, a golden olive woodpecker, presumed to be a juvenile due to its bland face pattern, a pair of russet-backed oropendulas, and a torrent pteranulate, nowhere near a river but perched in a field. Having crossed the Cosanga River, we tried some birding along the Guacamayos trail. Initially the weather wasn't too bad, but pretty soon birding activity was severely diminished by more rain. We sought refuge at our next lodge, the Cabanas San Isidro, at an elevation of just over 2,000 metres. Thankfully, the rain eased by nightfall, and we were able to explore the grounds in search of the lodge's famous resident owls. They look like a hybrid between black and white and black-banded owls. However, this elevation is out of the range of both. No one knows yet whether they are a previously unknown subspecies of either, or a totally new, undescribed species. Whatever they turn out to be, they are worth putting in the effort to see. The next morning, a scenic mist hung over the valley in front of the lodge. As we waited for breakfast, Inca jays came to visit, usually considered a different species to the similar green jay of Central America. They were joined by a couple of subtropical caciques, another recent split, this time from scarlet-rumped cacique. Nearby was this singing male olivaceous siskin. A lemon-browed flycatcher, and a couple of russet-backed oropendulas. The nominate form here in the east should have black bills, which these clearly don't have. They are possibly juveniles, but it is unclear if that's the explanation. Another lodge, another Antpitta stakeout. This time it was the white-bellied Antpitta, below the restaurant veranda. A pair came out to feed on worms, but only this one showed well. Thankfully, the weather stayed fine after breakfast. Montane woodcreepers were around the lodge. They are the only woodcreeper with a decurved bill likely to be found at these elevations. Also pale-edged flycatchers. They are of the Myarchus genus, renowned for looking very similar. This species is uniform above with no contrasting crown. The name comes from the diagnostic pale edge on the outer tail feathers, visible from above and below. In the same area was a calling smoke-coloured pewee. A foraging black-billed peppershrike, a glossy black thrush, a mountain wren, and a small flock of beryl-spangled tanagers, including a female feeding a juvenile. Back at the lodge mid-morning, the hummingbird feeders were a hive of activity. If anything, the chestnut-breasted coronets were more plentiful here than they had been at Guango. Fawn-breasted brilliants also visited, but were often chased away by the feisty coronets. They often sought solace by perching nearby. Sometimes joined by a bronzy inca. At other times, though, the feeder seemed a haven of harmony and tranquility, when the regulars were joined by long-tailed sylphs and diminutive and rather wary speckled hummingbirds. After more rain early afternoon, we drove again to the town of Baeza, this time visiting the dubious venue of the town zoo, but which also hosted a rather good eco-reserve. A hard-to-see tropical parula was by the gate, soon followed by this montane foliage gleaner. Thankfully, a female velvet-fronted brilliant in the eco-reserve was much more approachable. Females look very similar to green-crowned brilliants, but their ranges don't overlap, with this species confined to the subtropics on the east slope. And finally, an exquisite little marble-faced bristle tyrant. It was carrying nesting material and was evidently close to a nest site. So after briefly enjoying its company, we let it be and headed back to San Isidro. Back at the lodge, a golden-crowned flycatcher was perched in trees over the approach road. We stayed here until dusk, finding a sickle-winged guan going to roost. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, we went in search of potoos. eventually locating this relatively rare Andean potoo. Although similar, they are darker than the common potoo and have a white patch on the wing coverts. We departed from San Isidro in low mist, but at least it wasn't raining. So we decided to try the Guacamayos trail once again. By the parking area there was a pearled tree runner and a pair of rufous spinetails. The trail was more productive this time, and we soon located a male green and black fruit eater. They are the most regularly encountered fruit eater, but rather special nonetheless. Also a lovely rufous-crowned toady flycatcher. In open habitat were common bush tanagers and blue-winged mountain tanager. We were now heading down to around 1500 metres altitude and to Wildsumaco Lodge, part owned by Jonas. We made a few roadside stops on the way. At a quarry along the Larito Road were a very accessible pair of blackish nightjars. They are typically found in rocky habitats. The male usually shows a little more white patterning than the female. Another pull-in produced a cliff flycatcher perched on overhead wires. Distinctive and often unflycatcher-like, but with a typical tyrant flycatcher hunting technique. We also stopped off at the bridge over the Hollin River. This golden silk orb weaver spider had made its home here. By the time we reached the lodge, the rain had returned. Thankfully, the feeders back at the staff residences were still busy with hummingbirds. A fork-tailed wood nymph sat out the worst of the showers. Maybe a subadult male, as the throat feathers did not appear to be fully developed. The colours on this adult male were striking in comparison. The female is green and white, with a white-tipped blue tail. As the rain eased, it soon became apparent that the common hummingbird here was the golden-tailed sapphire, and mostly males. Actually more bronze than golden-tailed, but still a very smart hummer. Females lack the male sparkle and are green flecked on white below. The largest and most dominant were the Napo sabrewings. Only males were on show, with their blazing green crown and blue bib. Also here, a female black-throated brilliant. The buff malar stripe distinguishes them from the male. And joined at this feeder by a female Gould's jewel front. female white-necked Jacobin. And finally, brief glimpses of an Ecuadorian pied-tail. Despite the name, they can also be found in the Andes of Colombia and Peru. Back at the lodge, the feeders were quiet during another heavy shower. Although the large cecropia tree in front of the veranda kept us entertained, initially with this plumbeous pigeon, but then rather more impressively by this male golden-collared toucanet. There was actually a pair, and the very different but equally striking female also soon appeared. Followed by a male golden olive woodpecker. By late afternoon, the sun finally broke through and the feeders returned to life. Amongst the first to grab our attention were the spectacular wire-crested thorntails. Aptly named, with elongated decurved crest feathers and a long spiky blue tail. That only applies to the males, which were in the majority. Females have no crest and short tails. A female joined a male at one of the feeders. We were also treated to a rare event, a male displaying to a seemingly indifferent female. Rather less flamboyant were the many spotted hummingbirds. The heavy spotting on the breast and flanks is their most obvious feature. Also a just visible buff tone to the base of the lower mandible. They are local and scarce in Ecuador, being commoner in the south of their range. There were also brown violet ears, their plain plumage offset by extravagant ear tufts. One of the few species happy to sit out the frequent showers. A male rufous-vented white-tip put in an appearance. This is one species where the name better fits the female than the male. The male has a white blob on the tail and at best a pale buff vent. Only on the female is the tail tipped white and the rufous buff vent more apparent. Plus Peruvian racket tails. These have orange buff fluffy trousers as opposed to white, shown by the booted racket tails on the west slope. And green hermits. This individual is probably a female with its long central tail feathers, or possibly a young male. This adult male is obviously darker. Other species we had already observed at the residence's feeding station, such as the golden-tailed sapphires. Often their plumage seemed even brighter when they were feeding. The beautiful fork-tailed wood nymph was another that lit up the feeders. There was another female black-throated brilliant. But this time the Ghoul's jewel front was a handsome male. Tearing ourselves away from the veranda, we went in search of the male Andean cock of the rock, which sometimes emerges to feed from the forest at the back of the lodge. Somewhat surprisingly, it was very approachable. This Andean subspecies is obviously more orange than those we'd seen near Mindo. There was another male golden-collared toucanet here too. We had 2 full days to explore around the lodge, dodging the frequent showers. A good start was a stage for another Antpitta show. The first to appear was an ochre-breasted Antpitta. This was the same species we'd spent time with at Angel Paz's reserve near Mindo. Wonderfully charismatic little birds. Followed by a new species for the trip, a larger plain-backed Antpitta. A variety of trails crisscross the lodge's property. Top quality birds abound here, but can be hard to film. One that did show was this scarce chestnut-tipped toucanet, like a crimson rumped, but with no red rump and a paler throat, as well as a male blue-rumped manakin, and a female western fire-eye of the black-bellied form. It's the females that show very obvious racial differentiation. In classic shrubby open terrain, we found an olive-chested flycatcher. A typical small, double wing-barred flycatcher, often identified by habitat preference. Nearby was a male spot-breasted woodpecker. A male smoky brown woodpecker was at another clearing by the entrance gate, along with a blue-necked tanager. And a dark-breasted spinetail. A golden-faced tarannulet called from the forest edge. And a flock of crested oropendulas were watched flying to roost late one afternoon. Looking out from the veranda was always worthwhile, and a welcome solace from the rain. This male collared trowin showed particularly well. One of the pair, but the female kept mainly hidden. A male red-headed barbet appeared in the Cecropia and began feeding on the fruits. The same fruits also attracted a many-banded aracari. This is the only aracari with 2 bands across the underparts. This site is quite high for them, as usually they aren't found above 800 meters elevation. Nearby were noisy black-mandibled toucans. As well as magnificent Inca jays. More fruiting trees around the lodge revealed maroon-tailed parakeets. They are generally wary, and although there is maroon colour in the tail, it's unlikely to be seen in most views. Also a black-faced dacnys, a sooty-headed pteranulate. They have a distinctive call. And a female yellow-breasted ant wren. During another downpour, a tropical parula arrived. A montane foliage gleaner was also seen here. And a foraging thrush-like wren. In the grounds, a black-billed thrush sought shelter under a bush. This is the common thrush of the eastern lowlands, but the disturbed habitat around the lodge is typical of its preferred environment, even at this altitude. Flowering plants here entice this male blue-fronted lancebill, always difficult to see well, and a male violet-headed hummingbird. It had a particular preference for the garden's verbenas. As with the lancebill, they were never seen visiting the feeders. Black-mantled tamarins sometimes came to feed on bananas in front of the veranda. This was the end of a wet but wonderful visit to the east slope of the Andes, in time to move on to the Amazon.